Welcome everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are doing something a little different. For those that watch this channel, you may already be aware that I typically talk about Nintendo pretty much every day. But as the title suggests, for today's video, I'm going to be giving you my first thoughts on Elden Ring, which is a non-Nintendo game. However, I'm talking about my thoughts on Elden Ring as a Zelda fan. And I thought this would be an interesting way to go about things, because I've noticed that there does seem to be a significant overlap between fans of Zelda and Elden Ring. And so I was very curious why there was this overlap, and for a while I've been waiting on playing Elden Ring anyways, and I've now finally decided to play it, and I've put in about 30 plus hours into the game so far. I'm not close to completion at all. I'm really sinking my teeth into it, and I'm really enjoying it, but I thought this would be a fun discussion to have. But before going forward, let me point out that we are currently reaching for a goal of 40,000 subscribers, so if you do enjoy my content, please subscribe and hit the notification bell, and enjoy the ride, as we talk about Nintendo almost every day, and apparently sometimes slightly other different things. So the first thing I would like to dive a little bit into here is this overlap we've seen amongst Zelda fans and Elden Ring. And to be clear, Elden Ring is not my first Soulsborne game. I've played Dark Souls, I've played Bloodborne, and I love those games. They are some of my favorite games. And there's actually several other Souls games that I've been meaning to get to that I haven't. FromSoftware just keeps pumping these babies out, and they're all fantastic. But when looking at specifically Elden Ring, something I've noticed is that there's a lot of theorists out there that will make lore videos on Elden Ring, and that's fair. The Soulsborne games in general have a lot of lore to them. The stories are very vague, I would say, at least from an outsider's point of view if you're more of a casual, and it's not like really in your face about it, and there's a lot of things left for interpretation and analysis. But then you look at The Legend of Zelda, and there's also a huge emphasis on theorizing and looking into lore with Zelda, and so that's where I think there's a little bit of this overlap, at least to some extent. But going beyond that, though, I think there's a little bit more of a connection here. Not just Elden Ring, but a lot of the Soulsborne games deal with some semblance of a medieval world, but obviously with a lot of fantasy elements, as does Zelda. Now, the Soulsborne games are a lot darker, and the Zelda games are a lot brighter, and Zelda games are definitely made to appeal to a larger audience. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that Elden Ring can't sell really well. It has. Last I heard, the game has surpassed 23 million copies sold, which is insane. Now, Elden Ring is available on multiple platforms, and Zelda's only available on Nintendo platforms, but what I'm trying to get at here is that Zelda's lower on the ESRB rating, it's also in general easier to play, and so it's technically more inviting to a wider audience. The Soulsborne games in general are definitely more hardcore-centric. These games are extremely challenging by comparison. Now, with both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, I think they've actually raised up the difficulty level quite a bit for the Zelda games, and it's something I've really appreciated. But the Soulsborne games are even harder than the latest Zelda games. And to be clear, I'm not trying to say that Soulsborne games are basically like a more hardcore Zelda. Not really, they're different experiences, and so I want to be really clear about that point. I'm not here talking about how Elden Ring is a replacement for a Legend of Zelda experience. It's not. When you're playing the Soulsborne games, you're not going to get the same style of dungeons and puzzles and interactions in that way. You can't manipulate the world or adventure with crazy abilities the same way you can in Zelda. The Zelda games, especially recently, have been very focused on puzzling and adventuring and platforming, and there's so much you can do with that, it stands on its own. But with Elden Ring in particular, I do feel like they've definitely advanced in terms of the enjoyment of adventuring throughout the world. Because Elden Ring is an open world, you can do things out of order, it's a massive, massive area that you can explore, going wherever you so choose, but there is also a main story, and there is some linearity there that you can choose to follow at any point. So the Sites of Grace show this light of grace that kind of guides you throughout the map. And somewhat similar to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, when I first started the game, for the first 20 hours of Elden Ring, I didn't bother with the story at all. I just went around exploring, finding items, fighting bosses, doing some side quests, and just discovering the world in the natural, organic way, And it was only until the recent last 10 hours that I started focusing just a little bit more on diving into the story. And when I've played Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the very same has occurred. I don't necessarily focus on the story. I do things how I choose. And there's so much to do. And so that's another similarity, just the open world structure of the games. But as I've been exploring throughout Elden Ring, something I've noticed is that the way the world is structured is extremely similar to Tears of the Kingdom. So what I mean is, the surface has a massive world to explore, but there are also these massive underground areas that you can find, very similar to the depths in Tears of the Kingdom. Now, the depths is an entire second open world map, and you can access it seamlessly in Tears of the Kingdom by diving through these giant chasms. But I still find myself reminded of the depths when playing through these underground areas in Elden Ring. And I'm not here trying to say, oh, one game copied the other. Both games were in development around the same time. Tears of the Kingdom came out afterwards, but of course, that initial teaser trailer was already hinting at underground exploration. I don't think either of them are copying each other. I just think it's just an interesting coincidence that there's this similarity here. But even going beyond that, there are also the catacombs that remind me somewhat of the caves that are also in Tears of the Kingdom. And so it's just interesting that there's a little bit of a structure here that's similar. But where I would say these games differ quite a bit is combat. And I would say combat is the best part of the Soulsborne games, including Elden Ring. And I might even be finding myself loving the combat even more in Elden Ring. I'm only 30 hours in, but I can see myself perhaps falling in love with Elden Ring even more so than prior Soulsborne games, because I'm diving deeper and deeper into the combat, and it feels like this game just has even more depth and more to sort of explore and do when it comes to combat. You have the option of choosing different classes, and I chose the warrior class because I felt like it would be even more of a challenge. I don't have a shield by default, or at least I do have a shield, but that's not the main point of the class, and so pretty much 98% of the time I'm moving around without a shield, and so I can't rely on the shield as a crutch to defend myself when I'm getting attacked. I have had to learn how to dodge and space myself and sneak around and take out enemies from behind, or just get really good at avoiding every single attack. I'm basically a glass cannon, and it's been a challenging experience, but it's also been a thrilling, satisfying experience. When I've gotten to the point where I can pretty much avoid like 90-ish% of every attack from a boss, yeah, I might take a hit, but I'm good enough that I can space back out, heal myself up back to full health, so I'm not taking as much of a risk, and I go back in, dodge a move, land a few hits, dodge a move, land a few more hits, and I've been using a bleeding set, so I'm building up some bleed damage, and then that pops, and that's pretty fun to see. And so I've been getting better at this game in this way without the defense, just getting really good at dodging, and that's been really fun. But a new element that they've introduced in Elden Ring that has mixed things up a bit that I really appreciate is the jumping. And so this impacts combat because it gives you another avenue for dodging and avoiding things when you see a lot of low attacks or area of effect attacks, and that's very useful. But I should mention that the jumping impacts exploration as well in Elden Ring. I didn't really focus too much on the exploration, even though I mentioned I would. And so between the jumping of the character and then also moving around with Torrent and the abilities it offers, exploration in Elden Ring is also pretty thrilling. And it ties into the combat because you will find just unique bosses in the world. There are the bosses you find at the end of a dungeon or a castle when you're exploring the main campaign, or even some side events or catacombs. But there's also just bosses in the overworld. Similar to Zelda as well, there are bosses in the overworld. But there are a lot more unique bosses in the overworld. And they're all very challenging, they all have their own styles of fighting. And each one's a mission to learn and adapt to, and figuring out their moveset so I can avoid every attack and space myself and get to the point where I can knock out their entire life bar before they knock out mine. I will say though, there are multiple moments in this game where I am reminded of the Lynels in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. And the Lynels are some of the hardest enemies in Zelda. They're amazing. They give me a little bit of that Soulsborne feeling where you have to be really good about your dodges, your parries, finding openings and dealing attacks, and they have pretty hardy health bars, so it does take a little bit to take them out. But with Elden Ring, given that it's the focus, there's even more depth and nuance to this. And so over time, I've come to really enjoy this. Now, something that's been missing in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom that I miss from prior Zelda games are the Dark Nuts. And if you don't know who the Dark Nuts are, they're basically these really powerful, highly armored knights, which you have a lot of in the Soulsborne games, including Elden Ring. And fighting these guys are very different from fighting the giant bosses. It requires a different approach. And so that's been a really fun learning curve for me as well. Just recently, I sorted out how to start dealing with these harder boss knight enemies. I was really thinking I would have to use an entirely different class or weapon set to deal with them, like having a shield. But in my practicing of learning how to parry with the shield, I realized that I was just dodging this enemy naturally a lot after a little while. And so I went back to just going full-on typical warrior class, and I was dodging pretty much every move, and I was able to start beating even the knights here, which just has me really excited and proud of my achievement. It was quite the learning curve, but I have now gotten to the point in the game where I don't think I really need a shield at all. The shield that I would use as a crutch in Dark Souls and thought I might need to in Elden Ring, I've now evolved past that. And that just has me really excited for how much more I'm going to learn and enjoy as I progress in this massive game. But moving beyond that, I do want to harp a little bit more on the differences in themes and aesthetic for the different series here. Because as I said earlier, Elden Ring and the Soulsborne games in general are very dark in comparison to the Zelda games. While I do think there's overlap between the Zelda fanbase and the Soulsborne fanbase, if you're not into really dark experiences where there's a lot more death and not necessarily the happiest ending for a lot of characters, you may not be super in love with what you get with the Soulsborne games. There is a lot of depth to the story and the lore and the characters, and there is certainly charm as well, but it's definitely dark, and you're not going to be left with the brightest, cheeriest of feelings. Now, that isn't to say that Zelda doesn't have its dark moments. Just play Majora's Mask. That game is all about grief, but there's definitely a clear difference between the styles and themes of these games. Now, moving on to another thing I would like to discuss here is my uncertainty with the story. I'm not trying to make this video a review of Elden Ring, or even really a preview. It's just me talking about the game. And so I'm not trying to critique the story here necessarily. I'm intrigued by the story, I do want to learn more, but that's not really that important to me. Maybe it's because I'm a bigger Zelda fan than anything else, but I care more about the characters and how they develop and what's going on with them in the world of Zelda than I do in Elden Ring or even prior Soulsborne games. When I play these games, I'm more interested in the combat, the growth, and exploring and finding stronger and better enemies in a fun and interesting world. And so when I do hear dialogue, I am curious and I'm listening on. I'm not sure just how in love with the story I'm going to be by the end of the game. We shall see. It's a developing story. But it's just something I felt was worth pointing out here because with the Soulsborne games, as I said earlier, it's not really as in your face with the story as Zelda might be. And even with Zelda, story isn't necessarily the focus either. There's definitely a lot of debate within the Zelda community about how much focus there should be for the Zelda games. I personally really love the story in Tears of the Kingdom, just for the record, but I know there's many people out there that don't feel the same way. But to wrap up my ramblings for the day, I just want to say that I am loving it. I am loving Elden Ring. It is amazing, and as a Zelda fan, there are certainly things in here that I do appreciate. Something I didn't note from earlier is that just the Soulsborne games in general feel like they have a little bit of that Zelda and Metroid DNA, in the sense that you have these big, epic boss fights, but also, especially with the prior games, when you would obtain an item, that item would allow you to progress further. This is how Zelda and Metroid games worked in the past. And now with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, that's not really as much of the case anymore, but that also applies with Elden Ring as well. And so they've kind of had a similar evolution when moving into the open world structure. I think Elden Ring is amazing. I can see this becoming one of my favorite games in a very long time. I am loving it. Maybe I'll make another video in the future talking more about this game when I get closer to completion or by the time I beat it. But it's exciting, and if you haven't tried it before, and you're into challenging games, and maybe you're also a fan of just exploring bigger worlds with cool boss fights, you may want to check it out. It's not something available on a Nintendo platform right now. There was a little bit of a waiting period for me before jumping into Elden Ring because I did have some level of optimism that maybe we would see the Switch 2 sooner, and there could be an Elden Ring port, which I still think could happen, by the way, just later down the road. And so I was kind of waiting to play like a better version of this game, because I've had a PS4 for a while, and I could have played it on that, but I decided to wait for a more powerful console. And so recently I decided to buy a PS5, and that's why I'm now playing Elden Ring. And it's been a fantastic time, if you haven't been able to tell from all of my drooling over this game throughout this video. So I'm loving it. But those are my initial thoughts on Elden Ring as a Zelda fan. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care.